Maybe Chris, maybe you could make room
No,
for.
you're okay.
Just move down one. Just move down one. Greg, Greg, take a seat up here.
Hey, Jeff combed his hair.
I almost wore a tie. I couldn't quite bring myself to do it.
Oh, that's all right.
I was like, I know Joseph would love me to wear a tie, but.
Well, Greg makes fun of me when I don't wear a tie, so I had to wear one today.
I know. I asked him. I said, "Do we have to dress up?"
One so far. A couple of others said they were coming, so I don't know.
Anybody in your class?
Yeah, I had so Olivia's in my class down there. Olivia's in my class, and I had a couple of others who said they were going to come. Yeah, so.
Probably good that not too many of them came. This is the biggest.
Yeah, I know.
All right, well, maybe we should go ahead and start, I guess. It's 9:01. Somebody shut the door, and is it locked? If you can unlock that. If someone comes in later on. Yeah. Well, all right, well, thanks everyone for coming for Joseph's dissertation defense. It's been an honor being his dissertation advisor, and this is a project that I'm thinking about when it first started. A long time ago, I first started to talk to Joseph about the Nuremberg trials. You were one of the first people I met in Greensboro when I came for a job talk. Joseph came to the graduate student meet and greet. I remember that. And then he was just graduating from the master's program, where he did his master's in European history. Then when I got here, you were teaching over at A&T, and part of my regular pickup basketball game. So we started to talk about Nuremberg in between games, you know, and the possibilities of a topic that might be an American history topic related to Nuremberg. So this project sort of evolved from that point. You know, those original conversations led him to apply to the program. It's been fascinating for me. It's a trial that, you know, of course I knew quite a bit about, but not as much as I do now. And you know, it's really helped me develop my thinking about the history of human rights in this time period. I'm going to let Joseph talk a little bit about the project in some detail for people here who haven't read it, and then open it up to the committee for questions. So, Joseph.
Okay. So this is an intellectual and legal history. I focus a lot on ideas surrounding human rights and crimes against humanity, and where those terms play into the Nuremberg trial. And what I did was I focused on 3 Americans and who participated in the trial. Robert Jackson, who was the chief U.S. prosecutor, Francis Biddle, who was the chief American judge at the trial, and then John Parker, who was Biddle's alternate. And so I look at their views of human rights and international law before the Nuremberg trial, and then I look at what impact the trial had on them, especially when they come back to the United States after 1946. How does that influence their thinking about U.S. engagement in the international community, and what role should the United States play in this multilateralism, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and these sorts of international agreements, international institutions. So that's really the broad strokes of what the project looks at. And one of the things that I focus on is that they come out of the trial believing that the U.S. should take a much more active role in international institutions and in promoting human rights in the international sphere, but as I discovered through doing the research, they weren't always so consistent in promoting human rights in the U.S.
All right. Very nice, succinct thesis. So, why don't I open it up? Do you guys have particular? Maybe I should start with Greg, and we'll just go around the table. The other Americanist, and then we'll.
Okay.
We have a nice international committee here, so we'll do America, and then we'll do the rest of the world.
I have a fundamental question, but I also have a sort of a fun question first, and before we get into a fundamental. Chapter 5 you called Crimes Against Humanity, and by which I took to mean, we're talking about the crimes of the Nazis and as exposed in the Nuremberg trial. But you also spent a fair amount of time on an affair.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that title referred to that affair.
If there's a double meaning?
Yes.
Well,
or otherwise, why you included that. Because that's not intellectual history.
Mm-hmm.
It's social history.
Mm-hmm. So, I hadn't even thought about the double meaning. I'm glad you brought that up, Greg. So yeah, during the year, almost the year that they're in Nuremberg, these men are cooped up, and Francis Biddle is missing his wife a great deal, and so he has an affair with one of the British journalists who's there. I included that mostly because to show just how the trial wore them down. It was a very exhausting experience, and it was just a very difficult time for them. But I think in that time of stress, they were able to maybe think about human rights in a deeper way. But yeah, I know that talking with Mark at different stages of the draft, he kept telling me, when they're in Nuremberg, give us as many, interesting stories as possible, because we want to know.
Sure I said put the affair in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so I want to know, not that necessarily the affair itself would shape Biddle's views about human rights, but does it?
I don't.
Or what does it say about someone who is fundamental to the trial and also fundamental to your argument, which I think is correct, so I'm not questioning it, but to this kind of focus on human rights that comes out of the trial, should we think any differently about this development of these ideas given the behavior of some of these men? Especially since it was a I gathered, very public affair.
Yes.
Because she was a very prominent person.
Mm-hmm. And they weren't trying to hide it.
Right.
So yeah. Well, these men are flawed, and I don't think that they need to be perfect to be human rights advocates. But it is an interesting point. I mean, they're not necessarily, at least in this case, Biddle's not, the best example of marital fidelity.
No, and I'm not so sure that necessarily has to connect it with human rights. But you do emphasize, and this will kind of transition to my more fundamental question. You emphasize kind of throughout, and then particularly in the conclusion, that two things. One, that these men had an evolving understanding of human rights, and even developing that terminology. And then just the very notion of human rights more generally is an evolving concept. And you suggest in your conclusion explicitly that such as you alluded to in your introduction, that these men also had blind spots, particularly in the issues of civil rights within the United States after the Nuremberg trials. And you put a lot of emphasis on how future generations might determine or define human rights differently than present generations. So it's very much an evolving understanding. That makes sense, but I want to hear you talk a little bit more about, then what are human rights? Is there really such a thing?
What, because if they're always changing?
Right. To fit the current circumstances.
Yeah, this is a really challenging question. When the United Nations created and passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the American Anthropological Association said, this is ridiculous. You're trying to create universal standards that apply to everyone everywhere, and this is not possible. And so, their argument was that a lot of these beliefs that we hold are relative.
And culturally determined?
And yes. And so, I think that for future generations, we're always striving, or we should always be striving towards greater equality amongst people. And so human rights, by being the sort of universal ideology, they need to apply to everyone everywhere, and they need to be a kind of standard that people will adhere to in the hopes of making more equality for people around the world.
By which you mean political equality?
Well, there's certainly political equality, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes lots of other things beyond politics. It includes the right to work and those sorts of things. So I think that it's challenging because they do keep changing.
That's why historians need to understand it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I know one thing I've been pushing, Joseph, and there's this whole literature very quickly emerging of historians writing about human rights, which had not been a real topic for historicizing an idea that was really well historically contextualized in the past. Partly for this reason that you guys are sort of getting at, that this claim of universalism is almost sort of taken as actual rather than an idea, And if you recognize that what you're doing as a historian is to try and understand this very powerful concept, right? That there are rights that should be respected regardless of law, across cultures. Where did this idea come from, and how has it made an impact on history, I think is the question that should be driving historians, right? And we're at this formative moment at Nuremberg, and some people say, like, well, this is where the international human rights, legal and political modern present was born at Nuremberg. And that's a hotly debated issue, whether Nuremberg really was a pivotal moment or not. We could look at, well, how did this happen up close? And what I love about this is Joseph's idea was to look at the judge. Well, originally it was one of the judges, then we decided to put in all three of the American judges and look at what this experience was for them individually, biographically, how this concept, was revolutionary in their minds, or what impact it did have on them. And then they became important vehicles for sort of promoting that idea after Nuremberg, And so the personal, that's why I argued for putting the personal in, that the history we're trying to recover here is also, what was the impact of this trial on these influential figures? What was the connection of the Holocaust and the revelations, of the atrocities that they encountered at Nuremberg on them, and what can we understand about the psychological impact? So we're looking at the very contingent historical aspects of this, and the individual agency of these three. So I really thought that it played a lot into the dynamics between them, even the affair. The contrast between Judge Parker, this very sort of straight-laced Southern, gentleman, and Biddle, who was much more, sort of a player type guy. They had this relationship that ultimately they were pretty good friends, but also they were, the two debating these big issues. So, yeah. Anyways, that's one thing I want to put out there, that this story, it's an intellectual history contextualizing a concept, but it's also a multi-biography, and we're trying to get into the psychology and the personalities and all of where this fits into these people's lives too.
Okay, yeah, and as a window into the trials, and particularly these three people, especially since, if I remember correctly, only one of them had really been focused on in any serious way by scholars before.
Jackson.
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a real contribution in and of itself, even if you're just talking about the Nuremberg trials alone. I guess and maybe it's just the nature of human rights history, which maybe I'm not familiar enough with, because it didn't exist too much in the time periods I studied. It was very much dependent on who was calling the shots, or who was voicing the opinion. I mean, I did read this correctly, right? You are arguing that they're making a significant contribution to the evolution of what we call human rights.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess and my only problem is, then if there's this constant evolution, and we should say backsliding, certainly not among these people, but in the arena of human rights, what should we think of it? I mean, I guess that's where you do talk about this some, but I almost want to know more about what was their commitment to the mechanism of enforcement. Because clearly you have to have nations who sign on to agree that we will abide by these human rights. And through the UN or whatever, now the World Court,
the International Criminal Court,
right?
Yeah.
But what about groups that don't sign on to that? Is it legitimate to hold them to the same standard against their will? I don't know. I mean, I understand why murder is perhaps something that should universally be agreed should not be allowed, but and certainly genocide and things like that. But I don't know. I didn't come away necessarily knowing how these three felt human rights should be enforced.
Okay.
I was very satisfied with the way you described their evolution of their thought and their influence and the trial's influence. But without enforcement, everybody can have ideas about human rights, and it doesn't mean a whole lot.
Yeah, this is the struggle that we face today. This is one of the things that I raised in the conclusion, that the United States plays this pivotal role in creating the Nuremberg trial. Robert Jackson is often revered for being the chief U.S. prosecutor, and this is in 1945 and 46. You fast forward into the present, and the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court and wants nothing to do with
I guess not.
sacrificing that kind of national sovereignty to an international body. Right. And so you make a good point, because in the case of the Nuremberg trial, the United States is making a significant contribution to international law and international institutions, but now 70 years later, the United States has really backed away from that.
And you see the reactionaries here too. It's not as if the United States was, everyone was behind the idea of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN, let's, create an international order where we respect universal rights. There was a big reaction at home against those ideas. And I think that the ideas do have a lot of power, and some of what you can see here is how they have a life of their own, how they expose a lot of injustices, like segregation at home. The Du Bois and the NAACP immediately write that petition to the UN saying, we charge genocide, right? The United States is a perpetuator of genocide. The United States is a violator of human rights. And so all of a sudden, it's reflected immediately back to the United States, and questioning, a lot of what's happening here. And your actors have to deal with that too, both Jackson and Parker especially. Both not knowing what to do with that. They in some ways didn't seem to anticipate that when they were in Nuremberg, but then they have to deal with it when they come back, right? So I think the importance of the ideas having power is something I think you should emphasize, and that the limitations. Part of historicizing human rights is you have to be careful about getting into a debate about the philosophy, which is something that happens almost naturally, and you start questioning it too. We want to say, well, are there such things? And what aren't these people hypocrites? That's the first thing people seem to always want to go to, is if somebody is an advocate of human rights, they say, oh, but what about this that you're not talking about, right? I think the search for purity, or the desire to want to hold an external standard to people, distracts us from historicizing it and understanding that, of course, every advocate of human rights then and now are going to fail if you hold up some external standard of your own of purity and say, well, you didn't live up to my standard of purity. What we need to do is look at, well, what did they think it meant, you know? And then how did they deal with when other people threw things in their face of their contradictions and struggle with it? Did they try to reconcile? Did they just throw out the idea of human rights altogether, say, you're right, I'm a total hypocrite, this is a bad idea?
Mm.
They didn't, right? They sort of adjusted, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Joseph, could you speak a little bit to the issue I raised about, you know, how did these three men, and I think it's in here some, but maybe reiterate for us, you know, how did, I mean, the idea of human rights, you know, obviously fundamentally is a good idea, but
Mm-hmm.
how did they think it would be enforced
So obviously,
after Nuremberg?
support for the United Nations and making sure the United Nations had the authority to, you know, investigate any sort of human rights abuses. They did support creating a kind of a permanent Nuremberg trial, so there was talk of an international criminal court even at that time in the late 1940s, but nothing ever happened with that. I mean, and so these men die within 10 to 20 years after the trial. We don't get a permanent international criminal court until 2002. So they don't even live to see sort of the fruits of their labors. So they're supportive of an international institution like the UN. I remember Parker in particularly said that he was not, some people were afraid that the UN was going to become like this global world order that was going to take over from the sort of legitimate governments of different national groups. And Parker said, that's not how I see it at all. I mean, it's an international organization that we all agree to submit to, and we're the ones who are, you know, making up its international body. So they're very much supportive of the UN, and the struggle that I faced in doing this research is that they don't live long enough to see any of the enforcement mechanisms really take hold, because then the country gets plunged into this anti-communist hysteria. And so I think they're so preoccupied trying to argue that human rights and the UN are a good idea that they don't have, it's like the debate changed and they weren't able to focus as much on the enforcement mechanisms.
Right. Right. Okay. Opposite. That's really all I had.
Who wants to go in?
I love the dissertation. This is the first time I've done one where, you know, we read an earlier draft. So maybe you addressed most of my concerns in that, in between. And I really love the dissertation. It's very well written. It's very clear to argue. That said, could you, and I know you started with this, could you just maybe again quickly summarize the argument?
Mm-hmm.
What's your main argument?
So the main argument, obviously, these three men, the Nuremberg trial did have a significant impact on their views of human rights. And so when they did come back from Germany, they were advocating for human rights in different ways. It depended on the individual that we look at. But the nuance there is that they weren't always consistent in advocating for human rights at home, more so abroad than they were at home. So that's where I talk about Robert Jackson believes that communism is bad, and he is very supportive of violating the rights of Americans who are communists so that they can prevent communism from growing and developing in the U.S. And of course, John Parker doesn't really support integrating public schools. So there are these sort of nuances where they're very much supportive of international human rights law, but at home they're not as consistent in seeing that there are human rights violations taking place in the U.S. as well, and they're just not as consistent in advocating for those at home.
Okay. So that does imply a sort of a universal standard to which they should be held.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not living up to it, right?
Mhm.
Especially Parker. I'll come back to him in a bit. But first, I wonder if you could explain your title.
Okay, so I was trying to figure out a way to address the seemingly contradictory stances that they take towards human rights. And that's where I stumbled upon the term paradox, because there seems to be this contradiction where they are human rights advocates, yet they're not supporting all human rights ideas as a whole. And so it seems like there's this contradiction. Like in an earlier draft, I almost wanted to call them hypocrites, because it sounds like they're not really, you know, being consistent.
I've been urging him not to go there.
Well, and that was in an earlier draft, and so I had a wise advisor who told me not to do that. But
Hypocrisy is too easy to find throughout history.
of course, absolutely it is, yeah. So I mean, it seems like they're being contradictory, but what I argue in the dissertation is that, you know, they've got these blind spots where they just can't see that what they're doing is not consistent with human rights ideas. And we can see it
Yeah.
70 years later, but they couldn't see it at the time.
I like the title. And the one suggestion I had, you know, in the earlier draft that I didn't see maybe as much incorporated was a description of the sources. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, like what types of sources
Oh.
you're using.
Okay, so I relied a lot on so Parker's and Biddle's and Jackson's. I've relied a lot on their personal letters to and from family and friends and different, you know, dignitaries. I looked at a lot of the Nuremberg trial transcripts to see the kinds of things that were taking place, you know, during the trial. And so I did, when I traveled to the archives, I was able to look at these men's papers to see when they wrote down notes, and when they had conferences and they wrote down their notes, the things that they shared privately with each other. So I used a lot of their sort of personal letters, diaries, correspondence, and then a lot of their published writings. Since they were all lawyers, they left behind a lot of written documents. And Parker in particular published a lot in the American Bar Association Journal. So I used a lot of that to see what their ideas were on human rights.
And I thought you had a great source base. I did say my one suggestion for when you turn it into a book would be, you know, in the introduction, maybe at the end, a section on just describing your sources and more or less what you just said. And some of the, you know, there's differences there, right? Like a public audience versus a private audience. And those differences are sometimes very crucial in what a source can tell you, right? I would encourage you to do that. Parker, I still just can't, I know hypocrite, maybe not a good word, but I called him a ball of contradictions. You know, what gets me is, look, there were white Southerners at the time who understood what he just doesn't want to see, which is, you know, this was wrong, right? So I couldn't reconcile him in particular. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess, his evolution of thought or his lack of evolution of thought. I don't know how to.
Sure. In 1920, he ran for governor of North Carolina, and he comes across very strongly as a white supremacist, because
He never shook that, it seemed.
he says during the gubernatorial race that African Americans should not participate in the political process. That was part of his Republican lily white stance at the time. And then that's in 1920. In 1930, he was nominated for the Supreme Court, and that's what the NAACP threw back at him, was that you said 10 years ago that you weren't supportive of African Americans voting, and so we don't think that you're qualified to be a Supreme Court justice. But as you look at his judicial record on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, he was at different times he was upholding the rights of African Americans. And then after the Nuremberg trial, He was very much supportive of, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and these sorts of things. When you get to Briggs v. Elliott, and there's this question of, well, should school segregation be unconstitutional? Parker's initial thought is, the Supreme Court's already ruled on this. The Supreme Court has already said in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal is allowed.
Right.
And so...
And that was Jackson's initial position, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Plessy v. Ferguson is the law of the land. Separate but equal is constitutional. So Parker had initially ruled in Briggs v. Elliott that school segregation is not unconstitutional. Once the Supreme Court reversed itself, in the Brown v. Board of Education decision, then Parker says, okay, well, we should integrate at Chapel Hill, where he was a member of the Board of Trustees. But from what I gathered in the sources, Parker wanted to make sure Southerners understood that this was not going to be a case where the Supreme Court was overreaching and telling the states what they had to do.
Activist judges.
Yeah, activist judges. So he said school segregation is not constitutional, but if you still want to voluntarily segregate, which is what most churches do, then you can do that. And so I think he was trying to throw kind of a lifeline to a lot of Southerners to say that, yeah, the Supreme Court has decided that separate but equal is non-constitutional, but you don't have to send your kids to the same school with African Americans.
Right.
You don't.
The response was that, you can't require segregation anymore by law. But then again, you can't require integration. And that's exactly how schools were in the North. There were deeply segregated schools in many places across the North. There was no segregation required, and yet there was plenty of segregation, right? So he was saying, all right, that's the national standard now. There's nothing you can do to require integration. And then, actually taking affirmative action to busing and things like that to break it down.
The busing aspect.
The activist response, right? But so he was this was right after the Brown decision, and how do we deal with this?
I found him paradoxical.
Yeah, I don't remember, one of the comments in my, on your first draft that we all saw was, I thought Parker was gonna be the star, because you hadn't written a lot of the last third. And I was kinda surprised you still treat all three of them with equal time. But Parker to me is the most interesting.
He is.
And and who has the least written about him, right?
Well, originally, he wanted to do this just about Parker. It was about Parker at Nuremberg. But there just wasn't enough, particularly if you're writing about Parker and human rights at Nuremberg. It's going to seem to be a very disappointing and highly limited impact of human rights.
The least active role at the trial.
And then
kind of the backup, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the alternate.
Yeah. Now, I thought there just wasn't enough there for a whole dissertation, and then just came back with the idea, well, what if we do all three of the judges? And as we started to learn about Jackson Biddle, I find Biddle the most interesting of the characters. I like him the most, and I think he makes the biggest contribution too.
He's the most colorful.
He's colorful. He wrote a lot afterwards about human rights and internationalism, and so he I think maybe pushes the legacy the best of the three. But then what I really like too is the dynamics between them. I like the fact that they all come from different political points before the Nuremberg trial. Parker's a lily white Republican of the South. Republican of the South is really oddity at the time too. Jackson is a New Dealer close to Franklin Roosevelt, and similarly sort of a very conservatively moderate, force, whereas Biddle's like the liberal force in the New Deal. So you kind of get this array of across the political spectrum coming together, and then you see how afterwards each one is affected by it.
Yeah, I
Well-
thought that approach worked out well.
And I know you haven't asked me this, but I'll share it anyway. Writing about Parker was challenging because I met his family. And so I interviewed his grandson and his nephew, and his niece. And, you know, they have a certain memory of their relative. And so I suspect that they will read this at some point. And so it was a challenge to think about, how do I portray him? Not that I was gonna, you know, I didn't want this to be hagiographical, and I wasn't trying to make sure that the family would approve, but listening to their stories of him, it gave an interesting perspective than what I got from the documents.
Yeah.
Love oral history.
And one thing you do have to not overlook with Parker is afterwards, yes, he's pretty disappointing when it comes to civil rights, right? But the Republicans, you know, are being driven by the McCarthy, you know, Bricker people who are just terrified of international human rights law and the UN and the power of the UN over American national sovereignty. They're trying to fight that off tooth and nail.
Still are.
And they still are,
Like
right? We know,
helicopters, right?
exactly. And he doesn't go that way, right? He
Right.
fights back against them,
Right.
and he's one of the great critics of the Bricker Amendment and McCarthy. So, I mean, there's something anyway that he sort of came out a different kind of Republican than
Yeah.
that wing.
We'll just briefly, a couple more quick things at Greg's point, including, you know, even countries that do sign on to it don't always hold to it. Like the Soviet Union being a perfect case in point, but then, of course, as you noted, they flipped that around on us and they used the race issue to tremendous propagandistic advantage on their side of things. And see us as the United States as being a tremendous violator of human rights, which I think it is, you know, still is in some ways. So my last question then is a broad one perhaps, is human rights a Western concept? Kind of imposed on.
This comes up all the time.
Yeah,
This
sure
comes
it
up all the
does.
time. You know, and I like what Marianne Glendon writes about in her book about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt, because most of us focus on the American contribution. Eleanor Roosevelt being this leader of the group to push for the Universal Declaration, but lots of other countries are represented there. China is represented at this Commission on Human Rights in 1947 and 48. And so, you know, this idea that it's only a Western idea, you have to take into consideration that there's representatives there from all over the world, not just in the West. But it's an interesting question because it seems like when we talk about human rights, we do think that it's more of a Western idea that the United States or the West is sort of imposing on the rest of the world.
Well, but a lot of those other parts of the world are coming, just at that point, coming out of a colonial situation.
Right.
And to them, to push for this is an anti-Western stance, I would imagine. An anti-colonial stance.
Well, Elizabeth Borgward makes a lot of what she calls Nelson Mandela's Atlantic Charter, right, which is you know, an earlier formulation of international rights that immediately was taken up by, you know, anti-imperialists and colonial independence movements as, yes, this supports us and our independence movement and our critique of colonialism, right? And so yeah, is the language a Western language? Absolutely. I mean, it comes from the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the Enlightenment, you know, but it also goes out and gets transformed and applied in a lot of different ways and you know, does become a kind of world political language, you know, so it's taken up by in different ways.
Thank you for an enlightening education, Mr. Taylor. I learned a lot.
Well, thanks, Jeff.
Well, as the fourth person on the committee and kind of furthest removed, I guess, from the North American center and the actors in here, I found it really, really enlightening as well and really interesting. I thought that the structure of it, with all these biographical sketches holding together and then kind of looking at these figures, how they played a role and then what they did in their lives, although they didn't live through the period where these ideas were actually tested, road tested, kind of globally, and then you have, but you get to that later in the dissertation. But I just like I learned quite a bit. I was wondering the line, if there is a line to be drawn between U.S. or American society's notion of civil rights and the notion of human rights as it becomes applied internationally. If there is any line there, if there's some place to make a note of that, or are these concepts that apply domestically, we use the term civil rights for citizens of the United States, and then we're talking about human rights, we're trying to internationalize and generalize in our norms that then the rest of the world has to abide by in treating their own citizens for us to be able to have an interaction with them as a country. There seem to be several levels, and then I'm just kind of trying to figure out if there's some line in the thinking about that.
So you're right. When we talk about human rights, it's supposed to be this universal concept that applies to everyone, regardless of their nationality. And then civil rights is usually restricted to that individual government or national group. So one of the things that I mentioned in the dissertation is that the NAACP really latched onto this ideology of human rights early on with Walter White and W.B. Du Bois, but once they realized that human rights is not going to be the vehicle to attain the kind of racial equality that they want, they abandoned that project and focused instead on civil rights and then legal challenges that are the Jim Crow, trying to challenge Jim Crow and the sort of segregation and those sorts of things that were keeping them down. So I'm sure if Tom Jackson were here, he would give you a much more eloquent response about how there's this line between civil rights and human rights. But I would say that there is definitely a connection, but I just don't focus as much on that side of it. I'm looking at these three actors and how they are influencing and being influenced by this universal ideology.
Yeah. So these are biographical sketches. Then this is also an intellectual history that runs from that idea as it germinates in the aftermath of World War I, right? And then becomes the ideas that are shared when it gets to Nuremberg and then beyond. Because and I also really like the device you use for sort of data mining and kind of going in for terms and pulling. I thought, because we have the tools now to be able to search sources and so much is digitized, you can do things that other people had not been able to do in making sort of looking at the language that was used when we're talking about human rights. And I don't have to be on the few questions that I already had. Joseph, you said you addressed the tiny things that I had talked about. The other part, when you get into the I want to make a note about China, just because 1947, that would have been the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek's China. It was back into the second half of the Civil War with the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist forces were beginning to prevail at the point where this issue's come up. So I'd say this would be a very good time to be signing on to something that was strongly supported by that side of what's going to turn out to be, the Cold War standoff. I think there's context in a lot of these things in this era, because this is rapid international shift as we go from the post-war period into the Cold War era, and countries are realigning for diplomatic reasons as well as, they're looking for allies, and this is an institution that helps in their cause. So I think that the Chiang Kai-shek was not one of the great Democrats of the world, yet he is going to sign on to this, and the nationalists are going to sign on. At this point, by the 50s, you have the PRC, saying that all the things that they were sharing with their Soviet comrades, that the U.S. was full with contradictions and racial inequality, and had no ideological leg to stand on when it came to forcing human rights on the rest of the world. That's actually now been revived by Xi Jinping.
No more term limits.
That's pretty valid.
He's saying, why should we pay attention to outside, criticism, because it's just as hypocritical as it was back in the day. So, but the other the intellectual issue I thought was interesting, and this is just for the book, not for the dissertation, because you did what a dissertation should do. You went in, identified your problem, you have your thesis, you got tons of great sources, so you're speaking to the larger committee on this issue. But I think in the next stage, if you, in that, the kind of aftermath of their lives and what happens to the idea, because Telford Taylor's book would stand out to me, because that's, you know, that's when the argument was being turned back in a domestic argument, back on U.S. government and not being able to hold up in the wartime, causing atrocities that would have been put on trial elsewhere. In the aftermath, then that would, My Lai would have just been uncovered, although the book was being researched before the My Lai massacre happened. But, those connections are really fascinating. But and then the last thing, because of my field, talking about the Tokyo war crimes trial, you gave just a little bit of description of how Jackson's involvement was. You know, what, right? It was Jackson who was.
He wasn't involved.
He just chose not to. Yeah, but but not being involved was a choice, right?
Well, I mean, I suppose so, but I mean, he'd been away from the Supreme Court for a year, so I think he was ready to go back to work. So he just wasn't willing to give any more for the Tokyo trial.
Yeah, because that was just there. Some of the same ideas are being tested again, but on the other side of the world, and sort of in another context. Even, I mean, and look at the U.S. public's opinion of Japanese society and Japanese military effort is different from the way that European theater was treated, the way the German people were treated. So how then comparing those two trials, it would be interesting to see a little bit more about that.
Are there works in the historiography that do that?
That compare those two trials? I mean, there's always a chapter or a section of a chapter where people will talk about the differences, and they are many differences between the two. But I don't know.
Well, I mean, but especially on this issue though of human rights, this attempt to kind of enforce some sort of international idea about proper wartime behavior versus improper.
I'm not familiar with anything that does that.
Well, that's why I ask, because that bolsters your perhaps saying a little bit more about it. Not obviously you have enough here because it's really long as is, but just explaining, you can say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, you bring it up, and you bring up his reaction to it, but putting it a little bit in for the general public, because then we'd see I guess for internationalists, we'd see more of the way that this was treated on the other side of the world, which is then going to be the next theater for conflict, of the Cold War era.
Okay.
And there's the whole point of like Victor's Justice too. This documentary, Fog of War, Albert McNamara, mostly about Vietnam, of course, but about the first 20 minutes or so, he basically says if we had lost the war, they would have put us on trial for some of the actions of the U.S. and the Allies in World War II. It's a very interesting.
He actually says we would have all been convicted.
He says war criminals, as war criminals, exactly.
Yeah.
It
For
just kind of puts things in
like
perspective.
Like Dresden and
Exactly. Yeah.
Firebombing.
in Tokyo.
Actually goes through a whole list of some of the atrocities I didn't even know about until that movie.
He was responsible for the fire.
He was
He
fine.
planned out how many were going to die and what
Yeah,
exactly. That amount of formula.
He speaks from experience.
He does. Professional.
But it is an interesting
mass
twist on this.
yeah, well, which goes kind of to the whole contingency of human rights.
Yeah.
Which I agree is why historicizing it is important.
And in the process of this, you introduced me anyway to Telford Taylor, who is a fascinating figure. And it was way too deep into this, but I was like, wow, he should really be the fourth. He's the fourth person here.
Yeah.
Because he was Jackson's, assistant prosecutor, who then remained there and continued the prosecution in the subsequent Nuremberg trials, and then became even more than these three, an advocate, human rights, down to that book criticizing, the U.S. and Vietnam, which seemed to me like a great ending point for this story too, sort of winding it up with Telford Taylor and his critique of U.S. Actions, atrocities in Vietnam. So yeah, that was just another. Then also Quincy Wright's another person you discovered who's getting a little bit more attention in some other books too. But he's a Chicago political scientist who's talking about international order based on human rights well before Nuremberg, and he's part of New Deal advisors too, and one of Jackson's advisors at Nuremberg, and he writes quite a bit about this too. So there's even more here that you've sort of found in the process, and I think should be brought up to the surface a little bit more in the revisions and as you start to think about showing this to publishers.
Yeah, on that, on the ending point in particular, what jumped to my mind was the Carter administration, foreign policy and promoting human rights as the basis. It wasn't real, quite frankly, and it failed, honestly. And in fact, it was a disastrous foreign policy for the most part, right? But that we get to a point where a president, at least rhetorically, defines his foreign policy in those terms, I thought would be a good ending point, regardless of how it turned out.
And historians who've been writing about human rights really focus that on like the recovery of human rights moment, or even in the 60s, and the founding of the Amnesty International, and there's kind of a grassroots revival of using human rights language. That maybe that's the showing that it's come of age. When Carter embraces that rhetoric and says, "We are going to stand for human rights. We're going to get back to this vision that we failed to live up to." But that 70s moment, some people say, well, that we shouldn't really look too deeper than that about the history of human rights, because what we understand as human rights in our present started there. Some people say it starts with Carter's speech. Yeah. And what is so important about this is, those people like Samuel Moyne are trying to sweep under the rug the importance of human rights language at this time, that, oh, well, that's sort of window dressing. Nobody really meant any of that. And I don't think that's true. And I think that you have a contribution to make in, just showing that they really did see that as part of what they were creating, an international order. And a couple of the things, I've already said this to you, but couple of the critiques that I have is we should really be focusing on human rights international law sometimes. You often talk about human rights, but really their contribution is talking about international law. How do we create an international legal order that incorporates, concepts of universal human rights? So they do want to find a mechanism for it. They do want to make it international. They are looking to the UN and other international bodies as a place for it. And that's really important, that they don't want it to just be rhetoric. They are trying to put it into some kind of legal framework. And all three of them believe in that, So there are a lot of places, especially in the introduction, where I would just always add the words international law after human rights, international law, to be clear what we're talking about, not just rhetorical pose. And then I also I'm not actually a fan of the paradox argument, and I've said that before too, and I was kicking around trying to suggest different framework. One of my professors once said to me, after I used paradox to as a concept in the paper, that that's a cop-out. Paradox is the term you use when you haven't figured out how to explain it. So I kind of feel like paradox is, it is a little bit not enough of an explanation for me. You did start to get into a little bit about blind spots, and I think that is more useful of thinking about human rights, that there are always inherently blind spots. Whoever's talking about human rights, they have limitations or blind spots, things they're not addressing or contradictions. That is just the nature of it, right? But I don't think we should spend too much time focusing on that, because that's always going to be true. And that leads us back to the whole ahistorical problem that writing about human rights has always had, that we're applying some external standards. And when we're calling them, hypocrites, we're not really looking at, or we're falling into a situation where we're the human rights advocates saying this is what they should be believing, right? Rather than looking at, well, this is what they thought, and this is how they thought human rights could fit into various things like Judge Parker and segregation, you know. That's a solution to him. You know, we're not requiring integration any more than we're requiring segregation. That solves it as far as in his mind. We see that as terribly, you know, insufficient. You know, but if we become critiquing them too much, it loses the historical contextualization. So that's why I urge you away from that as your central theme. It's too much going back to we're critiquing their limits.
Mark, maybe that's part of one way you might even deepen the paradox is it's part of that paradox, which you know, your comments from my first question got to, I think, is this tension between the relativity and historization of human rights and the universality thereof. I mean, from 48 on, there had been a conscious attempt to universalize what is human rights and apply it across the board, but then as we see, it you know, it depends on the time and context. It's applicable only up to a point in a certain given context. And to me, that's sort of paradoxical, right? I don't know if the paradox is the right word, but there's some tension there, clearly, between this very issue. Do we judge them at the moment of their historical moment, their context, or do we judge them on some basis of understood universal in our time? But still, it gets back to Parker. People at the time.
They did, yes. And I think that's the important thing is look at the debate at the time and what they were saying and how they were defending it.
Southerners at the time who
absolutely
would have been on the opposite end of what Parker is saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, one other suggestion I would make, again, for the book, not for the dissertation, is, you know, they also make a very clear distinction going into the Nuremberg trials and even during, between what we would consider to be kind of crimes of war, you know, attacking countries that have not attacked you, and then what essentially became known as the Holocaust. There almost seem to be two separate things, and they all come in kind of, I got from this, agreeing that the war crimes, you know, attacking innocent countries, they kind of universally agree that should not be allowed, you know, that should be condemned. And then they came to the realization that there's this other thing and how extensive it was, and I think, you know, you can make even more of that, and you do, but, you know, emphasize it even more, that really broadened then their understanding, these three men's understanding of what human rights should be.
Okay.
It's not just one nation acting towards another,
Right.
it's how a nation treats certain populations, which is, I think, draws this, what you're calling a paradox, even more starkly, because they did not apply that very well within their own country.
And the title is catchy too. But on that very point, maybe the change I would suggest would be how the trial of the Nazis challenged and developed American support of international human rights. So I think that captures your argument more. Just challenged. It does challenge it, but it clearly develops.
Yeah, the way it's phrased, it kind of sounds like there's pre-existing support
Right.
in the
Right.
international human rights law.
No,
Yeah.
it becomes
But
the-
creating that.
Yeah, I think that the description of the trial and the atrocities and how everything unfolded did a very nice narrative there,
Yeah.
like just drawing in the reader to see how horrific it would appear at the time, revealing all this information for the first time, or willingly ignoring it, realize.
And given that, I've always been, this isn't necessarily key to your dissertation, but it's always struck me as how, I don't know, judicious they were in not just saying all these people deserve to die now. They let some of them go, who, you know, albeit had much more minor roles. But, you know, they clearly were absolutely shocked and horrified by what they were seeing, but they did see degrees of responsibility among the perpetrators. And that's admirable in the long run. The emotional stance you would think would be kill them all.
Someone wanted to do that.
Which I think is sort of shocking, just that, maybe this is that lull in support for the notion of human rights, that when you get into 78 and 80, when Pol Pot's regime is being uncovered about what happened in Cambodia, the U.S. at the time, absolutely no reaction. Zero. to an equally horrific genocidal act, auto-genocide that's going on here.
Even worse, Reagan administration insisted that Pol Pot's representatives maintain Cambodia's seat on the UN.
Yeah, that's Kampuchea.
I mean, they were, de facto, were supporting Pol Pot.
Like test case.
Should we open up to questions from others who are here? I saw a hand. Go ahead, Jenny.
And this is just building on where the conversation's headed, is do you elaborate at all on the emotional responses by particularly somebody like Parker, where when you're realizing the atrocities of the Holocaust, it's hard not to have, even though this is an intellectual history, it's hard not to have an emotional reaction to that, where for somebody like Parker, school desegregation would not have the same emotional reaction. So does an element of the emotional reaction to these atrocities play into that paradox at all?
That's a great question. So he was definitely affected the most of the people I look at, because he writes home to his son and tells him that he had a horrible day in court today. They showed these terrible pictures on the screen. So I think that we can't overlook the emotional gut reaction that he experiences, not just at that one video, but then also later on the Soviets show a video in trial, and according to one source, Parker was so disgusted he had to leave the room. So I'm sure that plays a role in his thinking, but I go back to the fact that they didn't find all of the defendants guilty.
Right.
So there was still, at least they were still able to have that distance when they were making the decisions about who we're going to find guilty and who we're going to let go. And they still found 3 of them not guilty, and they were acquitted, and they didn't have to be executed like several of the others.
Or some jamping. I still find that fascinating.
Thanks. I'm just wondering how much we put emotion into the definition and the evolution of human rights as a concept. Does a egregious violation of human rights have to elicit some sort of like horror, some sort of emotional response before we call it this violation of human rights that we can all agree on?
Mm-hmm. Well, usually there's something atrocious that happens, and the reaction to it is to create some kind of international law or safeguards to prevent it from happening again. I mean, the Holocaust is a prime example of that, but I mean, there are lots of other genocides that we can look at that have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The U.S. is falling over itself to not define that as a genocide.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that there is something maybe you could develop there. You know, the question of relating reaction to the Holocaust to human rights is a debated one. Some people don't think that should be, you know, that they were really reacting to the horrors. I'm not sure from here how much it was just the horror of the thing, but we see this again and again, that, you know, when there is something so, you know, unimaginably horrific, we need to appeal to something. How do we respond to that? What is this violation that we need, you know, some bedrock principle, and human rights is the one that's got the most power that people turn to. Again, it's like this, you can make it an international cause, you can shame the nations and the international bodies who didn't act. You know, how dare we allow this to happen? People shouldn't have this happen. You know, so it goes beyond law and everything else. It's kind of a moral argument that you violated human rights, right? And so, you know, that maybe there's a connection there. You know, when does something hit that threshold that it becomes a human rights violation? You know,
I was
we
just
can
thinking,
figure that out.
as a civil rights historian, you know, when Walter White boys abandoned this kind of human rights concept, is it because in the U.S. they just couldn't elicit that sort of emotional response to school desegregation that you could to genocide?
it's always easier to see the human rights violations that other people are doing.
Right, right, exactly.
Rather than your own, which you've long been used to and justified throughout your entire life.
It does seem though that there is a commonality, and that is the use of imagery, moving pictures as they were called, in TV for civil rights. Because it allowed people who were distanced geographically and otherwise from those events to have them broadcast, right in front of them, and kind of therefore be forced to confront what was going on one way or another.
Yeah, 'cause it's interesting, during World War II, the principle that Roosevelt really tried to promote is the force was mobilizing for World War II was non-discrimination, but not attacking segregation head on. But the idea was that, yeah, we don't have, and that's enshrined in the FEPC, but also in the Social Service Act of 1940, these non-discrimination principles, but not wanting to attack the segregation. But yeah, and the idea was that you can have non-discrimination and segregation, but I think you're right, once you get images, people knew that segregation was not, it was full of discrimination.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a powerful imagery of, that's Old Connor in Birmingham with the water hoses and the dogs,
The
and the young
yeah.
kids. That's the story on the Soviet evening news. So it's been around the world, global.
Linda had her hand
So
up.
backing up to what you're talking about with this, during the trial, part of the framework was the hate, right? The ideas that of war crimes, that there are already existing ways that you conduct war, right? And so, did you talk? I only read the one little part of the book or the dissertation. So did you talk a little bit about the laws that were pre-existing as they were going into the trial?
I do trace some of that longer international legal history, looking at the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907. Especially in 1907, there's that clause. It's called the Martin's Clause that mentions sort of violations of the laws of humanity, and I use that to sort of track the development of this concept of crimes against humanity. So violations of the sort of laws of humanity becomes this kind of crimes against humanity later on. But I do talk about some of that longer history. I think it's necessary because at the trial, whenever the judges are writing their final judgment, the verdict, they reference those earlier international laws as a basis to give the Nuremberg trial legitimacy.
And I think that also shapes how they're talking about these as atrocities. It's not as human rights necessarily until later. It's more.
Well, he does talk about that
Yeah.
because there's different categories of crimes that they're looking at, right? And some of them are violations of treaties that are all about, and as you say, Jackson knows those are his strongest arguments because he can demonstrate those pretty easily. But that's that category, crimes against humanity, that goes beyond any previous treaty or written law to these general principles. And Jackson didn't rely as much on those because his strongest arguments were on other things. But I think Joseph shows that that's an important part of what they were about, and particularly afterwards, the legacy of what this meant. They really held up the crimes against humanity.
That's what makes it an interesting pivot point, right? Where it does kind of crystallize into this.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you talked at all about Project Paperclip, because when I think of paradoxes and the human rights carrying out this trial, like how does that deal with so-called useful Nazis that were brought back to the U.S. because their scientific knowledge was instrumental in the Cold War? Right. Like, was there a sort of a legal argument as to why they would not be prosecuted, or were their names just kind of erased from the list?
I don't talk about that at all. It's interesting. I'd have to do more research at this point, but no, I don't mention them as an example.
Well, that's where maybe Nuremberg kind of sets a precedent, right? Because they're not all treated the same just because they were Nazis or supported the German war effort. It depended on their role either as leaders making decisions for a larger group or direct involvement in what we would call atrocities. But yeah, the U.S. Still brought in some people who probably deserved a little prosecution.
That's where on the Tokyo War crimes trial, bringing in people engaged in biological warfare on Chinese citizens, many of the people involved with that effort are also disqualified. Not on trial, not part of it.
That's your paradox.
Yeah. Warmongering scientists.
Reward.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Joseph, so this is obviously an American history topic, but it has a lot of international dimensions as under it. And I'm just kind of curious, because I haven't read it yet, to what degree are you tackling to what degree are you tackling the conversation that your three Americans had to have with their British counterparts, their Soviet counterparts, and so on, in terms of formulating what that definition of human rights was going to be?
I don't go into that too much because I needed to keep the focus more on the Americans. Obviously, when they're at the trial, those 4 different nationalities are going to be interacting a lot. And so there's a great when they were in chambers discussing various fine points of law and how to adjudicate the defendant's guilt. So, I mean, there's a lot of information into what do the Americans think about this compared to what do the 2 Soviet judges think about this. I mean, in an earlier draft, I had tried to do some of that, but it just kind of made the narrative a little bit sort of convoluted. So I don't do that as much in the dissertation, but I can see your point that it would be useful to sort of see what they're all talking about and how they're defining these terms.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Because my question and the previous one both spoke to this larger sort of historiographical milieu in which you're saying you work. And you haven't talked too much about how it fits into the larger framework of discussions about Nuremberg in the sense of what have other scholars said. We know you're making a contribution by dealing with these 2 figures that haven't been dealt with, and of course Jackson has been covered pretty well. But you know, in the larger scheme of things, how does your work sort of expand the conversation?
So the Nuremberg trial has been written on a great deal. I talk about the historiography in the introduction, but only recently, in the last 15 years, has it been part of this conversation on the development of human rights. So, and a lot of that stems from the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002. So once that court came into force, scholars began to see this direct line from Nuremberg to the ICC in The Hague. So it's been relatively recently that we've been talking about what role does Nuremberg play in the development of human rights, or does it play any role at all? Because there are scholars who argue that the 1940s really isn't all that important to the development of human rights. They focus more on the 60s and 70s, or they'll focus on the 90s when the Cold War ended. And that's when you begin to see these international trials in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. So what I'm arguing is that the Nuremberg trial was an important moment in the development of human rights, and it also contributed to our understanding of the Holocaust. That's another controversial point that I didn't expect to be controversial. I thought it seemed logical that at the trial there'd be a lot of knowledge, or they would learn more about the Holocaust, but some scholars have been very much opposed to that argument, that they'll say that the Nuremberg trial really did not help with our understanding of the Holocaust, that our understanding of the Holocaust came about much later, in the 60s and 70s. So one of the things that I contribute is that, well, there was a great deal of emphasis on crimes against the Jews and raising awareness of the Holocaust. Just the fact that the U.S. Army was able to amass so many hundreds of thousands of documents made it possible for the earliest Holocaust historians to write about the Holocaust. Elizabeth Borgward is the first who really focuses on how FDR and the New Deal and the Nuremberg trial push human rights into this sort of international spotlight. And then I'm building off of some of what she does. But it's very controversial. I didn't expect it when I started the project 5 years ago. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about, does Nuremberg really contribute to our understanding of human rights or not? And I say, yes, it does. It absolutely does.
And Borgward really set the modern debate with her book, A New Deal for the World, which some people critique as being too American-focused. That, you know, it makes the U.S. sort of the formulators of this whole thing, which they really weren't, or not solely. And then there's this other new book, which I haven't read yet, but I passed on to you, Dan Plesch's Human Rights After Hitler, The Lost History of Prosecuting Axis War Crimes, which is about British War Commission prosecutions of war crimes, right?
Yeah, the United Nations War Crimes Commission, he focuses a lot on that.
So, which is 1940s, it's happening, isn't even happening before Nuremberg? There's
Happens
already
before, yeah.
these war commissions that are British run, using the concept of crimes against humanity, war, you know, it's violations of universal principles of individual rights. So there is a British story, and that's one thing that maybe it would be worthwhile looking to see, like, what kind of dialogue they had with those other war commissions that were going on at the same time. And when Robert Jackson goes to, you know, organize and plan the Nuremberg trials, he goes to London, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who's he talking to there? Like, where maybe there should be more collaborative sense of, you know, the Americans aren't doing this all on our own, but there's a dialogue about human rights going on that's already in motion, not only by some of the people you've identified, but people, you know, overseas too.
Mm-hmm.
I was glad on that point you do use Francine Hirsch's work on the Soviets. She argues actually the Soviets take the lead, as you point out. Yeah, the U.S. really didn't want it, initially at least Churchill and FDR didn't want to pursue this. And the Soviets are kind of pushing it. They had a different understanding. They wanted to do
Not
it
on
in
human
Soviet
rights,
style
but on a
show
trial.
style.
On a trial.
Yeah.
Guilty before, you know, anything even happened. But
Great.
they were pushing the idea of a trial stronger than anybody at the outset. I mean, you use Francine Hirsch. Tom Porter over at A&T, I didn't see, also argues this.
Mm-hmm.
See if I can track down. I know he's got at least a couple articles on it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is very much a, you know, issue that's being debated and published on as we speak, and Joseph discovered that Elizabeth Borgward is right now writing a comprehensive history of Nuremberg.
Oh.
Which
Get that book out.
we're hoping
Well,
isn't going to impinge too much on
I don't
steal your
think
thunder,
I don't
but-
think she's going to focus on Parker.
Yeah.
You know, or Biddle.
Some of these individuals.
Mhm.
No, your approach is
Yeah.
Well, that's one
Looks
reason
pretty
I think, I know this is an intellectual history, but it's broader, it's more than that, because
Mhm.
you're focused on these three men, and that's why I still wanna know what role the affair had in.
Must be some legal briefs that came
Work
out,
on that.
particular evenings later history.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, does he have one perspective on the proceedings before the affair starts, when he's all depressed and lonely and everything, and then a different one, you know, as the affair's going, obviously.
Maybe
I
this is
mean,
when
but-
the Soviets
but we
started
might-
blackmailing
I
him
mean, I
into
think-
becoming a Soviet agent.
He's already in like a better mood all of a
Right,
sudden.
because, you know, we, like you said earlier, we should not assume that these ideas are unchanging, right?
Mhm.
They have these ideas and they don't change, I mean, they do develop their ideas, and yes, it's partly a response to what they encounter in this evidence at Nuremberg, but maybe there's other contributions as well. Well, like, what was that woman, Rebecca West, what were her ideas about human rights?
Mm-hmm.
Because surely they talked.
Peace Affair was with Rebecca West.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's huge, right?
Yeah, that's, it's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I know, we need to look into Rebecca West.
I
a
mean,
little bit more.
she's super important, yeah, that would be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she might have been, that's what I mean, she might have altered his views some.
There's all sorts of British collaborations.
And Linda, I mean, Biddle had the worst pickup line ever, because when he saw her for the first time in like 10 years, he said something like, "What have you done to yourself? You know, you've let yourself go."
She was just,
Wow.
yeah, that's what she.
But
This affair is your paradox.
apparently the titles have multiple meanings, so there we go.
Exactly.
The A&E version.
Yeah, you could easily see a TV show made about how she influenced the thinking of the American judges, or of all the judges on, or at least Biddle, in terms of Nuremberg,
Mhm.
because they, I don't know if it's there or not, but do either one of them write about, does she write about her ideas about any of what's going on?
Well, she was there to cover the trial.
She published
I
quite a
mean,
bit.
she published several things about the trial. But I don't know if she ever really delves into her views on human rights.
But you need to search that one, you need to investigate that.
Because if she does express a pretty strong view, I think it's very safe to say she shared that with Biddle. And
Mm-hmm.
And she's a Soviet spy.
is she? Really?
All right, we might get rich.
Wow.
Maybe something there, I don't know if it.
I know, yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah.
But she's not a minor figure herself.
No, I very seriously think you should follow this thread and see what's there. You know, there's,
All right.
like any dissertation, there's a lot more research threads that you
Mhm.
can continue to search down, and that's another one. Any other questions or comments?
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
So, Joseph, you only write one dissertation in your life.
Yes, only one.
And it's, I mean, you know, it's quite a process, so I'm just kind of curious, how did you change? And I don't just mean in terms of like honing your scholarly chops as you did it, but I mean, like, how did you change as a person because of the subject matter that you studied?
Well, I wasn't expecting that question. That's difficult to answer, Eric. You know, I would say that I've become more interested in human rights causes in the last 5 or 6 years. I obviously, I read the current events in the news a lot differently when I hear about things that are happening in Syria or China, and even in the U.S. So I think for me, this project has given me, it's given me a framework to think about what should be the United States' role in upholding human rights standards. Because for a moment, the United States played this pivotal role in the 40s, but we seem a long way from that now, where the United States doesn't seem as interested in the same kinds of international justice that these figures were. So I won't lie, I've definitely gone to the State Department website and wondered if they'll hire me to you know, possibly contribute in some way to further a human rights agenda.
Maybe not this.
Not the current.
No, no, I remember, I started this project 5 years ago. Okay.
One of the several empty positions in the State Department now.
Right. You're far too qualified.
That's it.
All right, well, any concluding remarks you want to make?
I'm allowed concluding remarks?
I'll allow it.
Okay.
Remember, we still have yet to sign.
Right.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
I love my committee. They're the best committee I've ever had. And, you know, no, I have grown a lot. I mean, Eric told me not to respond to this, but as a scholar, I did grow quite a bit because, you know, I wanted to focus on Parker. All of Parker's stuff is at Chapel Hill, and so I thought that would make the research a little bit more manageable. But it was pretty fun to be able to travel to New York, and I'd never been to New York before. To go to Columbia and do research there, and then I was able to travel to Missouri and do research at the Truman Library, you know, and so go to DC. I've been to DC a couple of times. Went to Georgetown and the Library of Congress, and so it was pretty fun to do the research. And if you know, if I go back and look at the questions I was investigating 5 years ago, they're not even close to the same as the questions I'm trying to answer now. You know, and I really do credit Mark with taking the Nuremberg trial and sort of wrapping it around this framework of international human rights law, because I had initially looked at the Nuremberg trial when I was an MA student, but it was a very different project, and I wasn't thinking about the human rights scholarship. So I think that made the project a whole lot better and something that I can hopefully publish down the road.
I think it will be publishable. I'm quite certain of that. I think it's a great story and a great contribution to scholarship, you know, and that's the next stage. We can continue, of course, helping you as you start to move towards that. All right, well, one thing I forgot to mention is I didn't get a bibliography.
I've got
Did
it.
everyone
I can send it
else
to
get
you.
it?
Yeah, I can send it
Yeah,
to you.
it definitely has to have a bibliography,
Mhm.
you know, as part of the
I forgot to print it.
requirements.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, Joseph, congratulations on this really impressive work. And where do I sign?
You, I don't know how many copies you need to have of everything, but
2. I think we need to have 2 of those. Yeah.
well, I've got 2.
All right.
I think you had told me, give me 2. So.
How does Dr. Ross sound to you?
My mother-in-law is going to call me Dr. J, she said, so, you know, but Dr. Ross sounds good.
I think the basketball theme.
Yeah.
Isn't Walter White the guy from Breaking Bad?
Yeah.
He's also a long-time director.
They really don't cover that in the show.
I'm not sure, I can't remember what that
Early
was.
achievements, they really just glide over that.
Very confused by it.
After the human rights angle didn't work out.
What dates do I put on here? Just
Same-
today's
same
date?
date for each.
The same.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Make sure
I've gone through it enough times like this, yeah,
Feeding
it's the same date.
system, screw things up.
It would only be a different date if you were leaving this saying, you must revise or we will not sign.
Oh, wow,
We
okay.
did not.
No, so it's the same date.
That works for me.
Congrats.
I think you have to write something here, Mark. Greg, does he have to write something here?
I've done one of these for a long time.
I don't remember, obviously you want to put pass, but
Yes, please do.
I think I wrote something just so successfully defended the dissertation at E period.
I will now, I will now.
Good stuff, man.
Thanks so much.
I wonder if she remembers me from the basketball.
Hey, you remember Jan?
She might.
Basketball? I used to, yeah, you do.